Hello, I'm Russell Haythorne with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. Denver Decides is a community partnership dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver and the Interneighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Today, we are presenting a candidate forum in anticipation of the November 5th election. This election includes the candidates vying for District 5 as a member of the Denver Public Schools Board of Directors. District 5 is located in the northwest part of our city. Our format is a standard one. The candidates will be asked questions that are submitted ahead of time by the organizers of this forum. All of the candidates will answer all of the questions, and all of your responses will be timed. Our timers are out front, where candidates can easily see them. So let's begin by meeting the candidates vying to represent Northwest Denver's District 5. The candidates are standing right to left, facing the audience in alphabetical order by their last names. So, beginning to my right is Julie Banuelos. And next to her is Tony Corchio, and to his right is Brad Lorvik. Audience, please welcome our candidates.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you so much.
Candidates, welcome. And let's jump right in with the first question. Our first question will be for Julie, because your last name starts with a B. Lucky you.
Yep.
Julie, you'll have 1 minute to answer this question, and then we'll go down the line. Here's the first question. Some parents and others have said that moving Strive out of North High School would allow North to grow as a traditional high school. Where do you stand on this issue? You have 1 minute.
That's a great question. My name is Julie Banuelos. I am a former teacher. I taught 11 years in District 11, or District 5. Sorry. So with that, I'm going to tell you that I fully support the idea of North reclaiming its space. They need it for not only the pride that they have on the North side, the legacy, the alumni that's very strong. Also, we've had enough of kids getting ticketed for crossing the line into that other school. Plus, there's a competition for resources, and we know North needs that space, so we need to give that space back to that school alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Tony.
I think it's really important to remember that we're talking about kids and families. I've talked with Principal Scott Wolf, and he told me that he has the space they need right now. If at some point in the future there's not the space to be able to co-locate both programs, then absolutely, we need to look at alternatives to support both programs. But I think we're too quick to dismiss the families and students who are an important part of our community and make sure that we're committed to them as well as the kids that are already in North High School. My daughter goes to North. I want to support North High School, but I want to make sure that we're committed to all families in Northwest Denver.
Thank you, Tony. Brad.
Thank you so much. I've spent time in North at the CSC meetings, at some of the co-location meetings, and what I hear is a group of community members who don't feel listened to. Conversations weren't had enough before decisions were made, and I tell you, people are tired of being talked at. People want to be talked with. And so any decisions we make have to come from that place. I know that some rooms have been added to what North has. They knocked down some walls and reconfigured things and added more space, and they have plans to do so in the upcoming year as well. And that's based on listening to the community. And I want to make sure that North gets the support it needs. It's thriving. Its students are doing new things, and we see growth happening, and that is amazing. My daughter will be class of 2034 at North, and I want to make sure it has all the resources it needs to thrive when she's there.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for your responses to that first question. Second question, and Tony, we'll begin with you. What one thing, by the way, you have 30 seconds for your response to this question. What one thing about your professional or personal background makes you most qualified to be on the Board of Education? Tony?
My experience in the community. I've been committed to schools in North Denver for 18 years. I've been active in multiple organizations. I'm involved in the public side, making sure that I'm supporting our schools. On the private side, making sure that I'm an important part of my community, contributing as an organization, and making sure that we're volunteering across the organization. I'm involved in 2 boards. I understand the public, the private, and the nonprofit aspect of what it takes to make a community great, and I'll continue to submit and support those goals.
Tony, thank you. Brad?
You know, the neat thing about my professional work is it is public work. I spend each and every day serving in the community on behalf of a group of people that seek to build a home where all belong. I spend my time community organizing, listening to community concerns. The community has trusted me and the group that I work with, the congregation where I serve as a pastor, regularly, anytime there is a need in the community, and that's what I look forward to doing as we continue to care for the people of North Denver by listening and working together to overcome anything we need.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
Thank you. So the experience that I bring is that I taught almost 2 decades in DPS. And like I mentioned to you before, 11 of those years I spent teaching as a dual language Spanish component teacher at the Academia Ana Maria Sandoval, and then I worked 4 years at Centennial. I know very well what that community looks like. On top of that, I have the most shared experience with our demographics in DPS. With that, we need that lens because for far too long, we've been talked about what we need, and it's time for us to decide what we need.
Thank you all for your responses. On to question 3. And Brad, it will be your turn to answer first. It has been reported that per pupil allocation from the 2016 bond through mid-year is $2,800 for each neighborhood school student and $4,900 for each charter school student. What is your perspective on how this disproportion impacts equity for DPS students? Brad?
Every single DPS student needs the resources they deserve so they can thrive. What neighborhood you live in, your ability to choose a different school shouldn't affect the resources available to you. I believe equity is demonstrated when students get what they need, and we have schools who have not been getting adequate funding to tend to their populations of students, and that is critical. And it breaks my heart to see that a certain group of schools might get more than other schools when we realize all of Denver's students are our students, and they all deserve to be cared for.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
Yes, thanks. So, I ran in 2017, and I was one of the very few people that mentioned how the inequity of the portfolio model, the charter schools, how they've been robbing our traditional schools, our neighborhood schools of funding. This is one of the issues that DPS has when it comes to the inequity. We have people that have a few that have a lot, and many that don't have anything. DPS has swindled a lot of money back in 2008 when it came to the interest swaps. They lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and we need to find out where that went.
Thank you, Julie. And Brad?
Tony.
Tony.
So, it's a shame. I was on the bond. I'm still on the Bond Oversight Committee for Denver Public Schools for the 2016 bond, and we worked really hard on that. And that was a community process. Community members were invited to that process. And it's a mischaracterization to show that, to portray as though there's an inequity there. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build schools for all kids. A lot of those newer schools went to Northwest Denver. We had some great improvements to our schools across the district, and we need to make sure that we continue that, but it's not about inequity, it's about serving kids.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you all for your responses. On to our next question for the candidates vying for school board for District 5. And we'll start again with Julie, as our rotation indicates. Julie, what is your solution to Denver's late summer hot classrooms issue?
Great, very appropriate. So that question has come up recently because we've had a very hot summer, and 60 of DPS schools do not have adequate air conditioning or upgraded HVAC systems. Apparently, it's going to take $200,000 per school to get that fixed. So until DPS does something, we need to talk to our communities at those schools to find out if starting after Labor Day is appropriate for them.
Julie, thank you. Tony.
So actually, the number is closer to $3 million per school. We after next summer, we'll have 57 schools left that have to be air conditioned. I was looking at the data today. September was the hottest September on record. We've had 4 out of the hottest in the last decade. If I'm elected board member, I will commit to making sure that we pass the 2020 bond. We get the last 57 schools air conditioned so that we can make sure that our students and our teachers have a great learning environment so they can be more effective in their classroom.
Thank you, Tony. And Brad?
You know, I spent time with students who were saying that their rooms were too hot to learn, and they were right. And so we need to take different steps. I want to continue moving forward to make sure that every single school gets that air conditioning it might need. We recognize the world's only getting hotter. The pieces we need to recognize are we need a phased deployment of things. There are some very common sense solutions. We can use fans and windows and heat exchange systems that don't cost as much money but tend immediately. And it's right, a later start date needs to be talked about in individual communities to see if that does fit and work for them. The difference between the last 2 weeks and the first 2 weeks, if we shift the calendar.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you all. Or Julie, you had a chance to answer that. That's right. So moving on. This question is for all of you. Raise your hand if you have accepted an endorsement or a contribution from any sitting DPS board member. Tony, since you raised your hand, this question is for you. On what issues, if any, does your perspective differ from that board member?
You know, what I love about our current board, I think that we have a great board. They're highly dedicated and committed individuals, and I would say what we are, the people that are supporting me, we are alignment in our values for providing great education for all students. The nuances of how we do that are less worrisome for me than it is about our commitment to serving the community and serving our kids.
Thank you. On to our next question, and Tony, we're staying with you. What do you believe to be the role of the school board? And each of you will have 30 seconds to answer this question.
It's about governance. I think that the perception that somehow this is a facilitation role undermines the role of Denver Public Schools. We're thought partners with the superintendent. We're a governance model. It's our job to develop the policies that set the path forward for making sure that we have a great education for all kids. This is a $1.2 billion organization. This is not about the little problems. This is making sure that we have the capacity and the rigor to be able to jump in and figure things out for all kids in Denver Public Schools.
Thank you, Tony. Brad?
The school board's role is to represent the students and the community that elect us as we shape and guide the district together. We have people who are serving, the superintendent, the central staff, principals, teachers, who look to the board for where the money is going, what the values are, what the vision is, and how we are going to work together. And that has to be shaped by policy that's guided by the question, how does this care for our students, every single student?
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
The role of a DPS board member is to not only create policy, but I actually take the lens that applies most to the majority of students that attend DPS. Additionally, board members need to act in fiduciary responsibilities, and in addition to that, we need to be very transparent, and we need to be beholden to our constituents, not to special interest groups.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all for your responses. On to the next question, and I believe, Brad,
Yes, sir.
you will answer first. Denver's achievement gap for students of color is reportedly one of the highest in the nation. As a board member, what will you do to close that gap?
It is one of the highest in the country, and it affects so many of our students. We have to be very proactive. We have to pay attention to getting resources to classrooms. You've already heard about some of the disparities between different schools getting different numbers. At the end of the day, only 48% of the money DPS takes in is going to our classrooms. And every solution that helps us address inequity takes the funding that isn't in the classrooms currently. We need to recruit and retain more teachers of color. We need culturally responsive curriculum to continue to grow and engage every single one of our students. These are all opportunities we have to make sure we are engaging and caring for every single student across Denver.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
The achievement gap has widened, and the last 20 years of reform has only continued to make that exist, along with creating more segregation. What DPS needs to do to address the achievement gap is we need to hire and retain teachers of color. Research shows that if students have teachers that look like them, that are experienced, that know how to engage them, they will make strides. I also believe that we need to stop testing as much as we do, decreasing that testing that we're requiring.
Thank you, Julie. Tony?
We have to commit to all students in DPS if we want to close the achievement gap. We have to have teachers of color. Our teachers need to reflect the diversity of our community, the diversity of our students. We need to make sure that we have culturally relevant curriculum for all of our schools. We need to make sure that we have anti-bias training for everybody who touches a student. And we also need to commit as a group to making sure that we're getting the bonus to the hard-to-fill positions so that we can attract and retain the teachers so that we're providing the greatest opportunity for all of our students.
Thank you all for your responses. And now it's time for our lightning round. In this round, we'll ask you a short question, and here's how you will answer. If your answer is yes to a question, show a thumbs up. If your answer is no to a question, thumbs down. You don't have to say anything in this round. You simply answer by a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So here we go, and these questions are for all of you. Many studies have shown that teenagers need more sleep. Would you support a later start time for middle and high school students in DPS? Thank you. Would smaller class sizes that could create a more connected teacher-student relationship result in better mental health outcomes for kids? Thank you. Should charters and innovation schools, both of which receive public dollars, have the same teacher license requirements as traditional schools? Thank you. Instead of asking taxpayers for an extra $200 million for air conditioning as part of the next bond, would you publicly advocate for a school start date after Labor Day? Thank you. In order to ensure a reliable recruiting pipeline of teachers of color, would you advocate for a, quote, GI Bill type financial support program for DPS paraprofessionals and for students currently enrolled in Colorado colleges? Thank you. Do you think Denver school board members should be compensated? Trick question.
Trick question.
Thank you. Would you advocate for the sale of the property at 1860 Lincoln and the subsequent relocation of the DPS central administration offices to less expensive real estate? A few teachers have stated that the majority of staff psychologists and nurses are split between multiple schools. Do you support this DPS policy? And finally, do you agree with placing an upper limit on hard money campaign contributions for future school board races? Thank you all very much. And we'll continue with questioning, much like we did in the first round. You'll have 30 seconds to answer each of these questions. And I believe we're back to Julie to start. What is the single biggest difference between yourself and each of the other two candidates in this race? And you have 30 seconds.
Like I said, I was a teacher in DPS. I am a member of the Latinx community, which is about 68% of DPS demographics. I also believe that with my experience, my background in economics, I do sit on a board with the Human Services of Colorado. I know what it is to run a nonprofit. I also engaged in running a transitional program for homeless mothers. So I bring a very well-rounded lens.
Thank you, Julie. Tony.
Two things. The first is my experience advocating for families across Denver. I've been doing this for 18 years, whether it's at the CSC or whether it's the Bond Oversight Committee. In addition to that, I'm a businessman, so I understand what it takes to run a business. I understand what it takes to look at it. We're talking about a $1.2 billion organization. I work for an organization. I understand the complexities of the finance. If we want to hold ourselves accountable, if we want to hold DPS accountable, we need somebody who truly has the expertise to be able to understand what governance looks like at DPS.
Thank you, Tony. Brad?
Well, I do serve and work every single day with the people of North Denver and run not only a local nonprofit, but have been active at national and international levels with hundreds of millions of dollars as well. But the biggest piece for me is that I'm endorsed by Denver's teachers. The idea that I could sit with and be in conversation with our educators, share with them my values and my vision, and have them say, you're the candidate we want to see caring for it. For me, the best thing we can do to care for education is to listen to our educators.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all. Next question, and Tony, your turn to go first. Based on publicly available reports, through dark money, out-of-state organizations have spent nearly $900,000 for the benefit of some DPS board members. What is your perspective on the fact that this is happening in our local elections?
So I don't know about that. I guess what I would say is that I'm not here to debate the Supreme Court decision. What I think that we need to do is really focus on how we're delivering to our kids. I would love to see a reduction in all money that are coming into the campaigns. We're not increasing the quality of the discussion, but what I want to do is I want to make sure that we're discussing kids, delivering high quality outcomes, we're closing the achievement gap, and supporting our families and teachers.
Thank you, Tony. Brad?
You know, when I see that much money come into a race like this, the question that comes to my mind is, what do they expect to get back? And so I greatly worry about what people might be getting back for the money they believe they're investing. The money that's coming into my campaign is from my neighbors and teachers and other workers throughout Denver. Those are the people who they know that this is about their community, and that's why the outside money really raises an eyebrow for me.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
The amount of outside money that's coming here to Colorado says a lot about the power there is in sitting on a board seat. It also tells us a little bit about the values of those folks and the values they want to implement in DPS. For me, I'm not taking any outside money like that. I believe in making sure that this is a democratic situation where I actually represent the community and not outside interests. So for me, I've been doing this grassroots.
Thank you all very much for your responses. Brad, just because you're furthest away from me doesn't mean you don't get to go first. It's your turn. With District 5's diversity in mind, how will you vote in the best interests of all constituents in cases where there might be conflicting viewpoints or agendas?
For me, it always starts with listening to the community and being present and knowing that there's accountability. For me, relationships with groups like Padres y Jóvenes Unidos' Action Fund, where I'll be going to listen and be in conversation, not just as someone who's endorsing me to get elected, but who wants to be a partner in the work throughout the process of leading. Those are places and ways that I get to hear from communities whose voices need to be raised. And there's always a sense of accountability and sitting down to say, when there are conflicting interests, if I didn't choose A or B, let me explain to you why. And I'm always willing to have those hard conversations.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
You know, for so long, we as a community of Black, Indigenous, people of color, we have been told what's right for us. We have been given shoved models down our throat, marketed these beautiful pages to attract us to these schools that make up the choice model. For me, when we serve the most marginalized, the biggest population in DPS, we're going to win.
Thank you, Julie. And Tony?
Again, I've been doing this for 18 years. We had hundreds of people come in front of us when we were on the planning committee for the 2016 bond. We've had dozens and dozens of family and community members come to us as part of the oversight committee. There were hundreds of people involved in the revitalization effort over at Brown Elementary, where we were committed to that program. I understand with extensive work in this community that there are different expectations and different outcomes, but I know that we can work through those solutions together as long as the outcome of the child is front and center for everybody's goals.
Thank you all. Let's continue with our questioning of the candidates for District 5. And Julie, back to you to start. It has been widely reported, that the DPS board majority has been dominated by the reform movement for the past several years. To what extent are you aligned with this current board?
You know, I respect our current board members. However, we differ in values. I am somebody who brings not only almost 2 decades of teaching experience, I taught in Spanish, I taught in Title I schools, I was a Montessori teacher. I truly believe in the human potential. And for me, that's where I evoke the values that I am going to bring to the board. I don't believe right now, except for Dr. Carrie Olson, that the rest are teachers and they wouldn't have that lens.
Thank you, Julie. Tony?
I have a saying, in a world of black and white, it's my job to create gray. From my perspective, it's always a lot more complicated than anybody thinks. I'm not in one camp or another. I'm in the camp of kids. What I want to be able to make sure is that everybody understands what the complexities of the issues are and making sure that we drive back to outcomes of kids and that we're supporting the children in every single way possible. I'll work collaboratively with the board for outcomes that support families and children.
Thank you, Tony. And Brad?
I do respect the work our board strives for every single day. I do not align with the values that are labeled as reform, as you named, sort of being reported. In fact, listening to our community long for change and long for something different is one of the reasons I chose to run. It's one of the reasons I supported the teachers during the strike. These are values that are driving me in this work, and that's why I'm not receiving money from those reformers.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all. That brings us to our final submitted question from the forum. And Tony, we'll start with you. At some schools, PTA leadership fundraises hundreds of thousands of dollars for things like filtered water fountains and art teachers. Many other schools have little to no fundraising at all. How would you address this inequity in DPS?
I want you to know that first and foremost, I'm running on the value of equity. I need to support the outcomes for all kids. And we know that when schools are able to raise $250,000 and fund different levels of programming and educational experiences that aren't standard across the district, we are propagating the inequity across our district. We have to do more. We're going to start with the equity index. We're going to continue on with the equity assessment. We're going to make sure that we're serving families and kids. Equity is why I'm running. We have to support all kids in DPS.
Thank you, Tony. Brad?
There is no reason DPS should not be funding every basic need a child has in school. We can do that. We have to get more resources into the classroom. More than 50% of the money is not making it to our children, and it needs to be there. Parents will always fundraise, but it should be for things that aren't necessary. It shouldn't be for clean water. It shouldn't be for a music teacher. It should be every student needs those key pieces because our students are worth it, and our budget should reflect that.
Thank you, Brad. Julie?
This is a great question. I worked in schools that didn't have a PTA. I did work at another school that raised a whole bunch of money, $250,000, and they paid for our paraprofessionals. The thing with equity that I think my opponents don't understand is if our kids are 10 steps behind a regular, a normal average student or someone who has money, we need to give them 10 steps ahead to catch up. And that means it applies to funding as well. And DPS needs to really put that as a priority instead of saying, just catch up when you can.
Thank you all very much. Very thoughtful responses. Now we have a special guest from the audience. Her name is Aaliyah Quinby. I hope I got that right. Aaliyah is with the Denver Mayor's Youth Commission. Aaliyah, you're welcome to come to the podium and ask your question. And audience, a round of applause for Aaliyah.
Thank you. So this is a repeat question, but I feel like it's such an important topic that we should give our candidates more opportunity to expand. The question is, DPS has one of the worst achievement gaps between white and minority students in the country. How do you plan on lowering this gap?
Do you want me to go first?
Start with you.
All right. Well, thanks for that question. So this is wonderful. It came up earlier. So the thing is, we have failed our children, okay, in the classroom by not following mandated interventions, by not giving our special education students everything that's required on the 504s, the IEPs. We have failed our English learners by not following the consent decree, and we need to make sure that we have teachers that are experienced, that know how to connect, that are master teachers and know how to connect with kids.
Thank you, Julie. Tony?
Boy, I'll agree a lot with that. However, we have been following the consent decree, and I think that some of our biggest successes in Denver, especially North Denver, have been some of our dual language programs, where we've gone so much further in delivery. But we have a lot more that we can do. I think that I applaud the efforts of the school board and the superintendent in understanding the complexity of the equity issue and making sure that we're going in there and making intentional choices. When I was on the Bond Oversight Committee, I realized that we could do a lot to improve the facilities, but we need to do a lot more in providing the high-quality education, consistent leadership for all of our students.
Thank you, Tony. Brad?
In addition to some of the things I named earlier, we also have to have the hard conversations about privilege and race. We have to do the deep work ourselves as leaders. We have to start more conversations at the board level, at the central office, with our teachers. I'd love to see classroom volunteers engaging in bias awareness training as we all begin to look at how our system continues to perpetuate inequity, in addition to the specific ideas of more teachers of color, culturally responsive curriculum, and better funding so students get what they need to thrive.
Aaliyah, excellent question. Audience, another round of applause. And now we'll continue with our forum for District 5. And this is the round where the candidates can ask questions of one another. Each of you will select one of your opponents and ask them a question, and hopefully they'll have an answer for you. We will go in alphabetical order, so Julie, you get to begin. You can ask one question of one of your opponents, and each of you, if you're selected, has 30 seconds to respond. Julie?
I wrote my question down.
Perfect.
Because I want to make sure I get all the details. So this question is directed to Brad. Those who know their history of DPS know that District 5 was created with the other districts after communities of color fought for it, believing this would lead to greater representation of our communities, who continue to be underserved and overly disciplined in DPS. Coming from the Latinx community, we are constantly told by people who don't come from our community to trust them and that they'll fight for us. Yet we continue to see an achievement gap and different experiences that don't reflect the district's values and don't respect us. Given that, how do you think you can represent or even understand my community, given that 68% of the district is Latinx, despite the fact that we are barely represented in the teacher population, administrative roles, and of course, as board members?
Julie, thank you for your excellent question. Brad?
Julie, that's a question that I take very seriously. And actually, it's one of the questions that I pondered over and over and over the first 5 or 6 times I said no when the community asked me to run for school board. It actually took about 8 times before I was willing to begin the investigation, and I sat down with some of our elected officials. I sat down with Senator Lucia Guzman. I sat down with Senator Julie Gonzalez and Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, and I asked some of these very same questions. And I recognize that it's going to take a lot on my part. It's going to take regular conversation. It's going to take partnerships with groups like Padres y Jóvenes to continue that work.
Brad, thank you. And now, Tony, continuing down the line, your turn to ask a question of one of your opponents, and they'll have 30 seconds to respond.
This is for Julie. The most recent contract negotiations with the Denver Classroom Teachers Association resulted in a revised bonus structure where teachers at under-resourced schools are really only paid roughly $1,000 more than teachers at distinguished schools. Do you support increasing the bonus for under-resourced schools or decreasing the bonus at blue schools, and how would that work into pro-comp?
Great. You know, I don't believe in the bonuses. Those are like carrots for our teachers. What we need to do is we need to pay them a livable wage. I benefited from being in a green school. I got $4,000 a year. But you know what? You couldn't count on that. And the cost of living in Denver is so high that our teachers need 2 to 3 jobs to make a living. We need to give them a livable wage that's equal to the cost of living and what it costs to rent a single apartment in Denver.
Thank you both
Thank
very
you.
much. Brad, your turn. You can ask one of your opponents one question, and they'll have 30 seconds to respond.
Thank you. My first question is for Tony. Tony, as I'm out listening to the community and engaging in conversation, I'm having a lot of conversations with folks who are seeing the achievement gap, who are seeing the increased segregation, who are seeing our incredible teacher turnover, and I'm hearing that there's this understanding that this is the result of a decade worth of failed DPS policies. And I want to know how you're not a continuation of those same failed policies.
So I would say that our achievement gap has really been a complex issue. I would say that as Denver continues to thrive as a community, what we've seen is we've seen the displacement of some of our poorest kids. As we see the gentrification, we see children driven out of our schools. When my oldest child went over to DSST at Cole, she saw friends being forced out of the neighborhood. They were unable to attend their schools anymore. We seriously have a problem as a community that we need to come as a community to address. And it's not getting easier, but it's a community opportunity.
So we like where this is going, so we're going to continue with this one-on-one round. And Tony, it's your turn. You can ask another question of one of your opponents, and they'll have another 30 seconds to respond.
This one's for Brad. So Rocky Mountain Prep, a neighborhood charter school, is located less than half a mile from your home. Our District 5 is also home to Gals, Strive, UPrep, and the boys' schools. All these were born here in Denver, and were mostly started by former Denver teachers. According to your website, regarding charter schools and choice, you imply that through reauthorization, charter schools are not held to the same standards as district-run schools, and that they are perhaps serving outside interests. If you believe this, how can you effectively represent the parents and students of our charter schools?
Brad?
I appreciate the question, Tony. I believe that our charter schools want to be held to the same standards as every other school. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking for high accountability, and I think representing the idea that the bar shouldn't be lowered for anyone does care for every single parent across our district, because if they're loving their school and their child is doing well, then they're meeting the accountability we're asking for. So I think in asking for equity in how we review and how we authorize does care for every single family.
Thank you both. And Brad, again to you. You have the opportunity to ask one of your opponents another question. Your opponent will have 30 seconds to respond.
Yeah, well, since we're reading websites, Tony, I took a look at yours too. And one of the things, the first thing you see on your website is that you stand for great schools in every neighborhood. And I'm wondering how you can make that statement while taking money and support from people and organizations that have undermined our neighborhood schools for more than a decade.
I don't know about that. I guess I would say that the people who've supported me consistently are people who were from Colorado. Last I checked in the Denver Post reporting, you were actually getting more out-of-state money than I was. This is money from Denver people supporting Denver schools, making sure that we're driving the outcomes, that we're holding ourselves accountable. Their belief is in me and our ability to serve kids at a much higher level than we expect we can now. We know we can do better. We have to deliver on that. I'm not beholden to anybody except for our Denver kids.
Thank you both very much. Julie, your opportunity to ask another question of one of your opponents.
Okay. And this question has come up since I've been listening to Tony. So, Tony, this question is to you.
I'm in the middle.
Yes. So, Tony, you say that we have, DPS specifically, has not failed our English learners. You say that they have followed the consent decree. I want you to tell me, how do you know that? Because in our district, there are schools that are Tinley that are not following the consent decree. And you can tell me what Tinley means while you're at it.
So what I would say is that I'm not saying that we haven't failed our kids. We know we have. And we're talking about achievement gaps that are 45% when our 3rd through 8th graders are less than 50% at literacy, and that's on average. I know that we have to do more. I think that the compliance versus what the intent is, we have to do more. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We can do more with Denver Public Schools, and we have to focus on equity and closing the achievement gap for all kids.
We appreciate the lively debate from all of you. And now that brings us to the end of our Q&A segments for the evening. And now we go to our closing statements. Each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing statement, and we will go in reverse alphabetical order, which means we begin with Brad Lorvik. And Brad, you have 1 minute to make a closing statement.
So my name is Brad Lorvik. I'm a DPS parent, I'm a classroom volunteer, I'm endorsed by Denver's teachers, and I'm running for Denver Public School Board in District 5 so that we can make sure every student thrives, resources get to classrooms, that we have transparency in the budget, and that we see great teachers retained as well as recruited. I invite folks to visit my website, www.bradfordenverschools.com, and there you'll find, for example, a great endorsements page. But these aren't folks who just heard promises and decided to support me. These are people I've worked with for years. These are folks who have seen my work and are making their decision to support me based on what I have done, not just what I say I'll do. You'll also find a very thorough issues page. What you'll find there are real conversations, having the deep discussions, because I'm willing to have those hard conversations. You're not just going to get poll-tested platitudes from me.
Thank you, Brad. Tony.
I'm pretty sure that I'm Tony Curcio, running for Denver Public Schools for District 5. And I'm pretty sure that all the candidates here tonight are running for the same reason, that we want to have great schools for all kids. But I believe that I'm uniquely qualified for one big reason, and that's my ongoing commitment and extensive experience advocating for students and families in Denver Public Schools. I've continued to do that for the last 18 years. My parents were both teachers. My sister's a teacher. I know what it looks like to see teachers struggle. I want to make sure that we're supporting our families, supporting our teachers in a way that we're driving the outcomes, that we're delivering on the promise based on our existing hard work of what we expect to achieve in Denver Public Schools. My experience matters, and I'm here to continue to serve all kids in Denver Public Schools. I'm Tony Curcio, running for DPS Board of Education. You can check out my website at tonycurcio.denverkids.com. Thank you.
Tony, thank you. And now, Julie, your closing argument. You'll have 1 minute.
Thanks. So my name is Julie Bañuelos. I'm running for District 5. I'm the only licensed teacher running in this cycle. As you know, I spent almost 2 decades in DPS classrooms, 11 in District 5. I am running because the majority of DPS teachers can't afford to live where they teach. Many have 2 to 3 jobs to survive. Worst, we can't seem to recruit, hire, and retain teachers of color. I am running because the achievement gap persists. We need board members that will ensure that mandated instruction is followed, especially for our students receiving interventions. I am running because 62% of our property taxes go to DPS, but somehow we can't even get a transparent budget to tell us why only 43% of that money goes directly into classrooms. I am running to re-envision and reimagine what safety means for our students. We need personnel, we need nurses, full-time nurses, we need full-time social workers, we need to replace SROs with counselors. My name is Julie Bañuelos.
Very good. Julie, Tony, Brad, thank you very much. We appreciate you and your appreciation for our children. And now, audience, it's your turn. A big round of applause for our candidates for District 5. Our thanks also to Denver Decides and its partners, which include the Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. We hope we have given you a fair look at each of these candidates who want to represent Northwest Denver's District 5 on the DPS Board of Directors. And for a complete election guide, go online to denverdecides.com. I'm Russell Haythorne with Denver 7, and thank you for joining us.